The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima offered no softness, no welcome, no forgiveness. It swallowed the boots of the first wave of Marines as they hit the beach on the morning of the 19th of February 1945. Thomas Sledge, a 4-year-old sergeant from Kentucky, felt the familiar weight of the BAR digging into his shoulder. 20 pounds of steel, wood, and misunderstood doctrine. Too heavy, they said, too slow. He didn't argue, he just carried it. The landing craft ramp dropped, and Thomas stepped into a world that no training had prepared him for. The air was thick with salt and silence. No gunfire, no explosions. Just the sound of waves slapping against metal hulls and the heavy breathing of men who had memorized their mortality. He moved forward with his squad, eyes scanning the black terrain that looked more like the moon than any battlefield he'd imagined. In the distance, Mount Suribachi loomed its slopes quiet, almost regal. It was a lie, and Thomas knew it. So did the Japanese. They were waiting. The sand was loose and deep, every step a struggle. Thomas's BAR, officially the Browning automatic rifle, bounced against his back with each movement. Most Marines hated the thing. Its bipod got stuck on everything. It jammed if not cared for meticulously. And worst of all, it forced you to carry more weight than any sane man should under fire. But Thomas had grown up carrying hay bales and hunting deer in the hills of Clay County. He didn't trust lightweight tools. The silence shattered exactly 47 minutes after the first Marines landed. Mortar shells arced overhead and began to fall soft thuds, followed by bursts of fire and rock. The air turned sulphurous, and the beach became a killing field. Men screamed, dropped, crawled. Training evaporated. Instinct took over. Thomas hit the ground hard, chest against the warm sand. His BAR was already off his back and in position, but what he saw around him made him hesitate. Dozens of Marines were pinned down, trapped between the rising dunes and the Japanese guns now belching fire from the cliffs above. The black soil offered no cover, only the illusion of it. A shell landed 30 yards to his right, throwing one of his squad mates Collins into the air like a rag doll. When the smoke cleared, Thomas could see what was left of him. That was the moment when the war became real, not a duty, not a concept, but a brutal arithmetic of inches and seconds. You might ask yourself, what would you have done? Laid still and waited for orders? Tried to crawl back to the water? Or held your position, gripping a weapon that doctrine claimed was obsolete? Thomas didn't have time to ask. He shifted his weight, adjusted his grip, and looked up at the ridgeline. Somewhere behind those rocks, behind the spider holes and bunkers, were men who had spent months preparing to kill him. Men who understood terrain better than he did. Men who would not run out of bullets. And yet, as the sand shook again and the sky flickered with artillery flashes, Thomas felt something unexpected. Clarity. He knew the weight he carried. He knew the limits of the BAR. But he also knew what it could do if used not as the manuals described, but as the battlefield demanded. And soon, on a lonely hill they called 362, that clarity would become history. Thomas Sledge was not the kind of Marine you'd find in recruiting posters. He had a quiet face, unassuming, eyes set deep beneath a weather-worn brow that came not from battle, but from sunrise mornings in the Appalachian Hills. Born in 1,921 inches, Clay County, Kentucky, Thomas was raised on tobacco fields, black coffee, and the quiet patience of a hunting rifle. His father, Emory Sledge, taught him to shoot at 9, not to kill, but to provide. Rabbits, deer, the occasional fox, Thomas learned early that a single well-placed shot meant meat on the table. He was taught to respect the rifle, clean it with devotion, and never pull the trigger unless absolutely sure. In time, those lessons, patience, precision, and practicality, would serve him in ways no boot camp manual could. By 1943, Thomas had volunteered for the Marines. He didn't do it out of vengeance or glory. Pearl Harbor had shaken the country, but in Clay County, war was still something that happened in newspapers. No, Thomas joined because his older brother already had. Because his mother's eyes wouldn't stop watching the radio when war updates came on. Because he figured, quietly, that if someone was going to carry something heavy through hell, it might as well be him. They assigned him the BAR, the Browning automatic rifle. 20 pounds unloaded, nearly 25, with a full 20-round magazine. It wasn't a weapon so much as a commitment. Most Marines tried to avoid it. Too awkward, too heavy, too slow for jungle warfare. The bipod snagged on vines, the recoil climbed high, and in the Pacific heat, it jammed like a farmer's plow in frozen soil. But Thomas saw something different. He liked the way it handled if you knew how to handle it. He cleaned it like he'd cleaned his hunting rifle. He learned its moods, the slight looseness in the trigger guard, the way the bolt felt when it was just a hair too dry. In training on Oahu, he spent evenings disassembling it by firelight while others played cards. Not because he wanted to be a hero, because if you were going to carry the burden, you'd better understand it. He didn't brag, but he didn't complain either. That's why his squad mates started trusting him with more than just fire support. They called him Steady, not because he was fearless, but because he stayed upright when others shook. By February 1945, Thomas was with the 3rd Battalion, 28th Marines, part of the 5th Marine Division under Major General Keller E. Rocky. Their destination, Iwo Jima, an island barely 8 square miles in size, but critical in the Pacific theater. From its blackened ridges, Japanese aircraft could intercept American bombers en route to Tokyo. It had to be taken, but no one expected what lay beneath its surface. Opposing them was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a commander unlike any the Marines had faced in the island-hopping campaign. He forbade suicidal banzai charges. He dismissed traditional honor in favor of strategic sacrifice. For 8 months, his men carved the island's belly into a honeycomb of tunnels, artillery nests, and machine gun bunkers. Most were hidden. All were deadly. Unlike earlier battles Tarawa, Peleliu, there would be no frontal defense at the beachhead. Kuribayashi let the Americans land, let them stack their men on open sand. Then, and only then, he would unleash hell. The target Thomas's battalion was assigned to secure sat toward the island's northern ridgeline, Hill 362A. Not particularly high, not even well mapped on Allied charts, but positioned like a dagger over the northern airfield. Intelligence suggested it was fortified. A few bunkers, maybe light artillery. No one really knew. Colonel Chandler W. Johnson, commander of the 2nd Battalion, was blunt during the final briefing aboard the USS Missoula. "They're not on the beach," he said. "They're under it, in it, around it, and Hill 362A isn't just some damn hill, it's a doorway. They'll come out of it like fire ants when we get close." Thomas listened without speaking. He'd studied the aerial photos. The hill was dark, ridged, and jagged like the spine of a buried animal. He didn't need a colonel to tell him it was trouble. There was talk about replacing the bar in the coming months. Command staff favored lighter rifles, more mobile units. In Europe, squads moved with support from tanks and airstrikes. In the Pacific, the jungle swallowed tactics whole, but no one had come up with a better replacement yet, so Thomas still carried it. And though he'd never say it aloud, he had grown attached to the thing. He understood its rhythm. 2-shot bursts for control, 5 if you had a clean line, full auto only when cornered. The recoil was predictable if you anchored your elbow right. Of course, none of that would matter if they never got off the beach. On the night before the landing, Thomas cleaned the weapon one last time. Not because he expected it to fail, but because he needed it to work. Every spring, every pin, every groove was checked with calloused fingers. It was ritual, not routine. Around him, the others played cards, wrote letters, prayed. Thomas didn't pray, not in the way others did, but he whispered something into the darkness as he slid the last magazine into his ammo belt. "Hold together," he muttered, whether to the gun or to himself, even he wasn't sure. The ascent toward Hill 362A began under a sky the color of burned steel. By late morning, the air was already thick with ash, drifting down like dark snowflakes. Thomas Sledge moved with his squad across the uneven volcanic ridges that rose like broken knuckles across the island's northern spine. The men were silent not by discipline, but by instinct. Every step felt like trespassing. Lieutenant Harris, the platoon commander, walked ahead with binoculars pressed to his chest. He was young, barely 26, with a sharp jaw and an even sharper sense of duty. Thomas respected him. Harris wasn't loud. He didn't bark orders just to hear himself speak, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders that morning. Around them, the terrain grew more twisted, unnatural mounds, fissures, and jagged shelves of rock left by ancient eruptions. It was the kind of landscape where danger could blend into the earth itself. Some Marines joked that the island felt alive. Others said it felt dead. Both were right. The BAR weighed heavily against Thomas's spine as he climbed, but he welcomed the familiar anchor. His breath was steady, his mind sharper than ever. In the quiet moments before contact, a soldier's senses always became heightened. Sounds felt closer. Breathing felt louder. Fear had a way of sharpening everything. They reached a shallow depression between two ridges, a natural bowl that led up toward the lower slope of 362A. Harris raised a hand, signaling a halt. The squad dropped low, weapons angled upward, across the dark terrain. "What do you see, Lieutenant?" one private whispered. Harris didn't answer immediately. He scanned the ridgeline with slow, deliberate movements. Then he lowered the binoculars. "Nothing," he said quietly. "And that's what bothers me. You can imagine the feeling, can't you? You're walking into a place where death is guaranteed, but nothing is happening. No sound, no movement, no sign of life. The silence becomes its own kind of enemy, one you can't shoot." Thomas tightened his grip on the BAR. The silence felt wrong, not empty waiting. Harris stood. "All right, move out, eyes sharp." The squad advanced again, climbing the gradual slope. The sand grew softer, deeper, swallowing their boots. Men cursed under their breath, not out of fear, but frustration. Moving uphill in volcanic grit was like wading through wet cement. Every step made you slower. That was when the war erupted. A single mortar round screamed overhead and slammed into the ground 20 yards behind the squad. The explosion flipped 2 Marines into the air, their helmets spinning away like kicked cans. Before anyone could react, a second round hit, then a third. "Contact! Take cover!" Harris yelled. But where? There was no cover, only sand, rock, and death. Machine guns opened up from the ridges above, sharp, buzzing bursts that cut the air like tearing canvas. The distinct rhythm of the Japanese Type 92 echoed across the slope. Dust kicked up in violent sprays as bullets chewed through the black earth. Thomas dropped to one knee, bar up, searching for a target, but the ridge was alive with muzzle flashes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared, like ghosts in caves. Marines scattered, trying to find depressions or chunks of rock. Some fired blindly toward the ridgeline, others froze, unsure where to aim. The entire platoon, 40 men, became a tangled mass of confusion and desperation. Then, the mortar fire intensified. One shell landed so close that Thomas felt the shockwave slam into his ribs. His vision went white for a heartbeat. When he regained focus, he saw Corporal Mitch Landers lying face down, unmoving, half buried in black ash. Landers had been alive 10 seconds before. Another explosion tore into the air near Lieutenant Harris. The blast threw him backward like a rag doll. His helmet clattered away. When he hit the ground, his body didn't move. "Lieutenant's down!" someone screamed. And just like that, leadership evaporated. The chain of command taught in tidy charts and bullet points shattered instantly. More machine guns fired. Mortars walked their way up the slope with eerie precision. Every rock, every shallow dip, seemed already calibrated. Kuribayashi's men knew exactly where the Marines would move, and they punished them for every inch gained. Thomas pressed himself into the sand, grit filling his teeth. He tried to sight the BAR toward the ridge, but every time he steadied himself, another burst rained down. The bipod snagged uselessly in the shifting ash. The textbook said, "Prone position, stabilize, provide suppressing fire." The battlefield said, "Lie still and die." Beside him, Private Ellis, barely 19, looked petrified, his hands trembling on his garand. His helmet was tilted awkwardly where shrapnel had grazed it. Thomas could see the boy's chest heaving. "Sergeant, where do we shoot? I don't see them. I don't see anything." Thomas swallowed, tasting blood and grit. "They're in the rocks," he said. "Inside the hill." "But how do we hit them?" Thomas didn't answer, because he didn't know. At least, not yet. A machine gun burst tore into the sand inches from his right hand. The rounds traced a line across the slope, cutting down 2 Marines who had tried to move positions. Thomas saw one of them, Parker, jerk backward and collapse, his body twitching. Something inside Thomas shifted then. Not fear, not rage, something simpler. Clarity. He saw, suddenly, how wrong everything was. How wrong the tactics they'd been trained to use. How wrong the assumption that the BAR was too heavy, too slow, too burdensome. The problem wasn't the weapon. It was the doctrine. The enemy wasn't out in the open. They weren't across fields or jungles. They were 30, 40, 50 yards away, hidden, protected, shooting from murder holes the size of fists. Prone fire was suicide. Staying still was death. Waiting for orders from men who were already dead was madness. He adjusted his grip on the BAR. The weight felt different now, not a burden but a tool that no one else really understood. He turned to Ellis. "When I move," Thomas said calmly, "you move. Don't think, just follow." Ellis stared at him. "Move where?" Thomas looked up the slope, toward the invisible line of fire. "Forward." Thomas didn't wait for permission. He rose into a crouch and started moving not laterally, not backward, forward, across the slope, toward the origin of fire. Volcanic ash flew with every step. The BAR pressed heavy against his chest, but the recoil no longer mattered. He didn't need perfect cover. He needed position. The enemy's machine gun fire stuttered as he moved unprepared for such a reckless advance. Most Marines were trained to find cover and hold, to freeze and return fire in bursts, to think in terms of geometry and lines of suppression. But Thomas had grown up hunting deer in brush so thick you couldn't fire from a prone position. You had to move. You had to fire on instinct, not formation. He fired in 2-shot bursts, not to kill, but to push them down, to keep their heads low. Suppression by aggression, not positioning. Ellis followed, stumbling at first, then matching Thomas's rhythm. He'd stopped shaking. His eyes were locked forward now, scanning for movement. The boy had crossed some invisible threshold, the one where fear becomes purpose. At 20 yards from the first enemy nest, Thomas dropped to a knee and emptied a magazine into a narrow slit in the rocks. The sound was deafening. The 30-06 rounds slammed into the stone face, ricocheting in bursts of spark and pulverized ash. Somewhere inside that hole, 2 Japanese soldiers vanished beneath the hail of steel and splinters. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the island itself had exhaled just once. "Reload!" Thomas shouted. Ellis was already beside him, fumbling with the pouch. His hands were steadier now, faster. He slid the fresh magazine into Thomas's hand without speaking. Thomas slammed it into place and rose again. They moved like that forward, burst, cover, reload each step, rewriting the way the BAR had been meant to be used. It wasn't a squad anchor. It wasn't for fixed suppression. It was a close-range hammer, devastating in motion, lethal in confidence. And it shook the enemy. The Japanese soldiers defending Hill 362A had prepared for frontal attacks from cover. They had mapped every inch of open ground. But they had not prepared for one Marine charging directly into the geometry of their kill zone while firing an automatic rifle without hesitation. Their own doctrine expected hesitation. Thomas offered none. 3 more Marines followed behind now, emboldened by the chaos Thomas and Ellis created. Rifle fire added to the momentum. Thomas's squad was no longer trapped. It was hunting. One enemy nest opened fire from the left, pinning down the group. Thomas spotted the muzzle flash just behind a cluster of jagged coral. Without pausing, he shifted angle and moved along a shallow trench, firing short bursts with every step. His rounds cut across the rock face in diagonal lines. The machine gun faltered, then stopped. He crept forward, barrel raised. Inside the broken stone emplacement, 2 enemy soldiers lay dead, one still gripping the trigger. Thomas didn't look at their faces. He just turned and motioned to Ellis. "Next one's yours," he said quietly. Ellis blinked, surprised. "I'm just the reload guy," he said, half joking. "Not anymore." That was the moment something changed. Not in the battle, but in Ellis. He wasn't the same kid who'd frozen behind a rock 15 minutes ago. The island had done what no training could. It had forged him. They moved on. Further up the slope, resistance thickened. Thomas was down to 4 magazines. The math was cruel. 1 mag per position, maybe 2 if things went badly. He adjusted his rate of fire 3-round bursts now, shorter, more surgical. The squad used terrain not for shelter, but for angles. They didn't hold ground. They pushed through it. Every position cleared opened another 15 yards of slope. They weren't just breaking enemy lines. They were breaking doctrine. Back in Hawaii, instructors had lectured endlessly on fire teams and flanking and base of fire support. Thomas remembered nodding, taking notes. But no one had told him what to do when the base of fire was dead and the flanking unit never made it out of the crater. So he built a new tactic. Suppress, advance, repeat. And with every burst from the BAR, the Japanese defenders grew quieter. The terrain still killed, but now it killed both ways. By the time they reached the halfway mark of the hill, Thomas's squad had retaken a dozen yards of contested ground. The price had been high. Landers, Parker, Harris, all gone. But something had shifted in the fight. The hill was no longer holding them. It was bleeding. Thomas crouched beside Ellis during a short pause in fire. Both men were soaked in sweat and ash, their faces smudged into rough shadows. "You scared?" Thomas asked, not mocking, just honest. Ellis nodded once. "Yeah, but not frozen." Thomas smiled, just a little. "That's the line that matters. And maybe that's true for more than just war. You see, doctrine doesn't win battles. People do. People who see beyond the page, who feel the terrain, and understand the rhythm of chaos. Thomas wasn't born for war. But war made him recognize who he really was. Someone who didn't need to be told how to fight, just given a reason. And, as Hill 362 arose before him, dark and jagged against the drifting sky, Thomas Sledge knew the fight was far from over. But he was no longer surviving it. He was shaping it. They reached the crest of Hill 362A just before noon, and for the briefest of moments, the world felt still. Thomas Sledge crested the ridge with his BAR tucked low, boots grinding against black volcanic gravel. Around him, what remained of his squad moved cautiously 14 Marines, counting the wounded. No officers, no radios, just instinct and breath. The slope behind them bore the scars of their push, burned earth, broken gear, silent bodies. Ahead, the terrain plateaued briefly before curving back into chaos. They weren't at the summit of the island. But they were higher than most men had gone that morning. It felt like winning. But war rarely rewards feelings. Ellis dropped beside Thomas, breathing hard. "Did we just take the hill?" Thomas scanned the ridgeline, then beyond. No gunfire, no movement. "I don't think we took anything," he said. "I think we were allowed in." It didn't take long for the truth to arrive. At 12:07, the first mortar hit behind them. Not close yet, but precise enough to make Thomas's spine tighten. It wasn't the random shelling of retreat. It was correctional fire. Walked in, calculated, intentional. A second mortar hit 30 seconds later, closer. Ellis looked at him. "They know we're here." Thomas didn't answer. He already knew. Somewhere inside the hill, within tunnels no map had ever captured, Japanese observers were watching, waiting. Their hill hadn't been lost, it had been breached. And that breach triggered a response that Thomas now understood had always been part of the plan. Kuribayashi's doctrine was simple: lure, isolate, destroy. And they had just taken the bait. The third shell landed directly on the slope they'd used to climb. The explosion sent debris flying, cutting off the trail of retreat. 2 Marines went down. Screams echoed through the dust. Then the line went dead. The field phone they'd carried from the beach, strung with painstaking care over rock and ash, had been severed. Thomas tried the handset anyway, more from hope than reason. Nothing. They were alone. Trapped. Ellis stared at the broken handset. What now? Thomas glanced at the scattered group, some wounded, some low on ammunition, all watching him like he was something he'd never wanted to be, the ranking man. He exhaled slowly. Now we wait. They pulled back from the exposed edge and regrouped beneath a shallow overhang. Volcanic rock jutted upward in twisted layers, offering at least partial concealment from the ridges beyond. Thomas ordered perimeter coverage in a rough 360. No one questioned him. The silence returned, but it was different now, not empty, but heavy, like a held breath. Ellis sat down beside him. The boy looked older than he had 2 hours ago. You think anyone's coming for us? He asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small envelope creased, sweat-stained. A letter. Unsent. Addressed to no one. He handed it to Ellis without looking. What's this? Wrote it on the transport ship. Was going to send it before the landing. Didn't get the chance. Ellis hesitated. Want me to read it? Thomas shook his head. Just hold on to it, in case I don't make it. Ellis looked down at the envelope, then back at Thomas. You're gonna make it. Thomas gave a soft, humorless laugh. I've been making it for the last 5 hills, but this one feels different. And it did. Not because of the firepower, but because of the silence, the calculated patience of an enemy that wanted them isolated, who had studied the psychology of American forces and built his defense not around strength, but around time. Time was the real killer. Time without resupply. Time without communication. Time to doubt, to fray, to fall apart. It was 12:43 when the first movement came, shadows flickering at the lower ridges too far for rifles, but close enough to be seen. Japanese troops, small units, emerging from holes that hadn't existed minutes earlier. Thomas counted at least 15, moving with confidence, not attacking, reoccupying. The realization hit like a brick. They never lost this hill. They had only let it go temporarily. You might wonder, what do you do when you realize you've walked straight into the lion's mouth? That the hill you thought you'd captured was, in fact, a trap designed to collapse on you the moment you believed you'd won? Thomas didn't wonder. He loaded a fresh magazine. We hold, he said, loud enough for the others. Until someone tells us otherwise, or until there's no one left to hold. No one argued. No one ran. They began preparing positions, shallow foxholes where the ground allowed, overlapping fields of fire. 2 Marines tended to the wounded. Another began redistributing ammunition. The fear was there, yes, but so was something else. Resolve. Thomas leaned his back against the cool rock and looked out across the island. Smoke curled in the distance where other units were still locked in their own battles. He wondered how many other squads were stranded like his, out of contact, out of plan. He felt the weight of the BAR on his lap. Its metal was warm, its stock dusty but solid. He'd carried it up this hill through fire and chaos, and now it would be the only thing standing between them and what was coming. He whispered to no one in particular. Let's see how long we can hold. At 13:06, the first wave came. Thomas saw them before he heard them, figures moving low across the slope, darting from crater to crater, shadows in motion. They weren't probing. They weren't hesitating. They were advancing. A full Japanese squad 10, maybe 12 men spreading out in a fan, rifles up, confident. They thought the hill was theirs, that the Americans on top had been softened, wounded, broken. They expected collapse. What they met instead was Thomas' sledge. He rose into a crouch, sighted down the barrel of the BAR, and opened fire. The first 3 rounds dropped 2 men instantly. The next burst walked across the ridge in tight, surgical arcs, suppressing the rest. Marines around him joined in, rifles cracking, grenades arcing. But it was the BAR that turned the tide. Automatic fire not from a fixed point, but from a man moving, changing angles, flanking positions that had expected static resistance. It was unorthodox. It was violent. It was effective. The Japanese squad faltered, then broke. Those who weren't hit vanished back into the terrain like smoke. Silence again, but not peace. Ellis reloaded for him. His hands moved fast now, precise. "You good?" he asked. Thomas nodded. His breath came heavy, but even. "First round was the test," he said. "They'll be back." They were. 7 minutes later, the second wave came 20 strong this time. Not a squad, a full platoon. And this time, they didn't come in a fan. They came from 3 directions at once. Thomas shifted his position, flanking left, using a natural ridge to his advantage. He dropped prone for only a second, just enough to sight and fire, then moved again. Never still. Stillness was death now. His rounds swept through the edge of a crater where 2 Japanese soldiers were huddled behind a broken outcrop. One dropped. The other turned to flee. But a third burst caught him mid-step. Ellis, crouched behind a slab of volcanic rock, was firing his Garand in clean, deliberate shots. He was no longer the kid who froze behind cover. He was a soldier now, made, not born. A grenade landed just 5 feet from Thomas. He kicked it with his heel, sending it tumbling down the slope. It exploded in midair, the force slamming into his side, but not enough to stop him. His shoulder burned. He ignored it. The Marines began to collapse inward toward a tighter circle of cover. 3 were wounded. 1 had died. Their numbers were thinning, but their resistance wasn't. And neither was Thomas's. By 1324, the battlefield had transformed into chaos. Smoke drifted low. Ash hung in the air. Bodies littered the ground, Japanese and American. The wounded screamed or whispered or said nothing at all. But over it all, the BAR kept firing. He was down to 3 magazines. Every shot had to count. He moved again, this time into the center of their new line. It wasn't strategy, it was necessity. The next wave would be bigger, and he needed to see every angle. Ellis dropped beside him, breathing hard. "Can't hold much longer," he said. Thomas didn't argue. He just checked the action on the BAR, cleared a bit of grit, and loaded another mag. "You ever heard of Thermopylae?" he asked. Ellis blinked. "What?" 300 men, against an army. They held a pass for days, long enough for others to regroup. Ellis gave a grim smile. "We're not 300. "No," Thomas said. "We're fewer." Then he stood and moved forward. The Japanese came again, 30, maybe more, rushing from the far ridge in staggered lines, some firing, others shouting. It was no longer a probing attack. It was a purge. Thomas didn't wait. He opened fire at 30 yards, sustained bursts, deliberate, cutting across the line. Men fell. Others dropped to prone. Some fired back. Bullets whipped past his ears. One clipped his helmet. Another sliced through his sleeve. He kept firing. 1 mag gone. He moved left, changed elevation, knelt again, fired short bursts, suppressing, wounding, pushing back. 2 more down, 3 wounded, chaos again. Second mag. He stayed moving, never in the same place, twice. Ellis followed, reloading, supporting, covering flanks. The 2 moved like gears in a machine forged in heat and ash. Third mag. Now it was desperate. A Japanese soldier rushed him with a bayonet, screaming. Thomas turned and fired point-blank 3 rounds into the chest. The man crumpled mid-stride. Blood hit Thomas's face. He didn't flinch. Last magazine. The hilltop was hell. Bodies, fire, smoke. The wounded crying for water, for mothers, for God. And through it, Thomas advanced on the final bunker. It sat near the far edge of the ridge, half hidden, its slit muzzle still pouring out deadly fire. From inside, a team of Japanese defenders coordinated the assault. If that position stood, nothing else would matter. He didn't hesitate. He moved straight into its line low, fast, unpredictable. Bullets sprayed around him. One tore through his left thigh. He staggered, fell to a knee, but still fired. 5 rounds. 10. 15. He closed to within 20 feet. Then he stood tall, braced the BAR against his hip, and unleashed the final 5 rounds into the heart of the bunker. The gun inside stopped. Silence. Thomas dropped to one knee, breathing ragged. The magazine clicked empty. He had nothing left but a blade, a sidearm, and whatever the enemy hadn't taken yet. But he'd done it. The bunker was silent. The advance had stopped. The hill was his. He looked around. Ellis was crouched nearby, watching, stunned. 3 other Marines still stood. Others lay wounded, scattered across the ridge. They had held. Thomas tried to stand, but pain lanced through his leg. His shoulder throbbed. He dropped to a sitting position, bleeding, shaking, but alive. You wonder, maybe, how long 15 minutes can last. In battle, 15 minutes is an eternity. 15 minutes of gunfire, smoke, screams, and sand. 15 minutes where every second holds life, death, and the thread between. In 15 minutes, Thomas Sledge changed the story of Hill 362A. He didn't do it with perfect tactics. He didn't do it because he wanted to be a hero. He did it because no one else could. Because the doctrine had failed. Because the weapon everyone else had abandoned turned out to be the one tool the enemy couldn't stop. The BAR, too heavy to carry, had become the spearhead of resistance. And the man who carried it? He was now more than just a Marine. He was a line that the enemy could not cross. The hilltop smelled of gunpowder and death. When the first Marine reinforcements reached Hill 362A at 1438, they expected to find bodies, American bodies. They advanced cautiously, rifles raised, eyes scanning for Japanese holdouts. But what they found was silence. And one man, lying in a shallow crater, cradling an empty weapon like it still held meaning. Thomas Sledge was barely conscious. His leg was slick with blood, his shoulder a mess of torn fabric and scorched flesh, his face caked in ash, and his hands burned from the heat of the BAR's barrel. But he was breathing, slow, shallow, and still alive. Around him were the bodies. 62, to be exact. Japanese soldiers sprawled across the broken terrain in arcs that told a story more vivid than any field report. They died trying to take the hill, and one man had made sure they didn't. Ellis was the first to reach him. He dropped to his knees, hand shaking as he checked Thomas's pulse. "Still here," he muttered. "You son of a bitch, you're still here." Thomas blinked. His lips moved, barely a whisper. "We held?" Ellis nodded, eyes welling. "We held." A corpsman moved in, pulling out bandages, shouting for a stretcher. Others fanned out to secure the hilltop, but no more resistance came. The battle was over, at least here. And for Thomas, the fight had moved inward. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, he caught sight of the BAR, lying beside a fallen stone like it had simply run out of war. One of the medics reached for it. "Leave it," Thomas rasped. Ellis stepped in. "No," he said. "We take it. It belongs to him." The medic hesitated, then nodded. They carried the man and his weapon down the hill together. By the time they reached the battalion aid station, word had already started to spread. There were rumors. A Marine had held off an entire company alone. A bar had saved an entire flank. One man had done what squads had failed to do. Most thought it was exaggeration. Stories always grow in the telling. But when the commanding officer arrived an hour later and walked the battlefield himself, he said nothing for a long time. He just stared. Then he radioed back, "Send a citation team. This one's real." Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness aboard the hospital ship. The morphine dulled the pain, but not the weight of what had happened. In the moments when he woke, he asked for one thing: Ellis. It took hours before they found him. The young Marine had refused rest. He'd stayed near the docks, waiting for the news. When they told him Thomas had survived, he climbed aboard and sat at his friend's bedside without a word. Thomas opened his eyes. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "You all right?" Ellis grinned. "You lost a lot of blood, sir." "But yeah, I'm fine." There was a pause, heavy, full of things unsaid. "You saved my life," Ellis added. "No," Thomas murmured. "You saved mine, Every mag, every cover, every second. Ellis looked down at his hands. I didn't know what I was doing up there. Thomas gave the faintest smile. Neither did I. They laughed, quiet, hollow, and then silence again. But the kind that healed, not haunted. You might ask, what happens to a man after something like that? Does he become a hero? A symbol? Or just a name in a file? Thomas Sledge didn't care. He didn't want the Medal of Honor, didn't want parades or citations or headlines. He wanted sleep, and quiet, and to never have to count bodies again. But history had other plans. His actions were recorded, analyzed, and turned into doctrine. The Marine Corps revised their stance on the bar, no longer just a support weapon. It became a tool for movement, for aggression, for men who understood that war didn't wait for permission. They called it the Sledge Model. Thomas never spoke about it. Not once. Not in interviews. Not in retirement. Not even when they asked him to. He would just shake his head and say, "It was 15 minutes, that's all." But those 15 minutes saved lives, changed tactics, and taught every man who held a weapon after him that sometimes the most criticized tool becomes the only one that matters when someone refuses to give up. And you, if you had been on that hill, would you have moved forward when the gun was empty? Would you have held your ground, knowing there was no help coming? Would you have carried the too heavy gun when everyone else dropped theirs? Maybe that's what made Thomas Sledge different. He never asked those questions. He just answered them. Thomas Sledge returned to American soil on a rainy morning in April 1945. He was 24 years old and walked with a cane. The war was still raging in Okinawa, and the Pacific Campaign had not yet claimed its final victims. But for Thomas, the fight was over. A stateside hospital in San Diego became his temporary home. Months of surgeries followed, nerve repair, skin grafts, physiotherapy sessions that made the hill he'd defended feel merciful by comparison. Doctors told him he might never regain full use of his left arm. He said nothing. When the brass visited generals in polished boots, medals gleaming, clipboards filled with citations, Thomas sat still, offered a respectful nod, and signed where he was told. The Medal of Honor was approved on the 28th of May 1945. He accepted it in silence. The press wanted interviews. The Marine who held the hill, the hero of 362A. Reporters used words like legend, machine, superhuman. They wanted to know what he was thinking during those 15 minutes. He said only, "I didn't want to die." Then he turned down every future request. But something curious happened behind the headlines. His after-action report, drafted by field officers, reviewed by HQ, circulated through the upper echelons of the Marine Corps. It became a subject of study at Quantico. What had happened on Hill 362A was not just bravery, it was a tactical revelation. For decades, the BAR had been seen as a relic, a World War I holdover, too heavy, too awkward, too short on ammo. But Thomas had shown something else, that weight could be leveraged as stability, that aggression could offset static defense, that doctrine mattered less than instinct when bullets flew. By July 1945, new training materials were being written. The sledge maneuver was unofficially coined a doctrine of advancing with automatic fire in short, deliberate bursts, using terrain, movement, and psychological pressure to overwhelm superior numbers. By the time the Marines landed in Japan, it had become a standard talking point in unit briefings. Irony whispered quietly. The weapon they had begun phasing out was now being reconsidered, not because it had changed, but because one man had refused to use it the way they told him to. After the war, Thomas disappeared. Not literally, but in the way that some men do when peace arrives. He declined re-enlistment, declined a public role, moved inland. Bought a small house in Idaho, and worked in a mechanic shop where nobody cared if your metals shined, only whether your hands were steady enough to fix an engine block. He never put his awards on display. When asked by neighbors what he did in the war, he'd say, "Pacific Theater, nothing special." Ellis visited him twice. They'd sit on the porch and say very little, sipping coffee, looking out across the trees. On his second visit, Ellis brought the citation. Thomas took it, looked at it, then folded it back into the envelope. "Read it?" Ellis asked. Thomas shook his head. "I was there," he said. "That's enough." Time moved on, as it does. By the 1,960 seconds, newer wars had stolen attention. By the 1,980 seconds, the BAR had vanished from American arsenals entirely. By the 1,990 seconds, most young Marines had never heard of Hill 362A. Thomas Sledge died in 2003. There was no military funeral. His request. No flags, no bugles, no 21-gun salute. Just a pine coffin and a note he left in his toolbox. Don't glorify the killing, just fix what's broken. And maybe that's the point. Not every legacy is built to last in headlines. Sometimes, the most important things a man does aren't remembered by name, but by change. The training manuals don't say sledge maneuver anymore. They call it dynamic close suppression. The field exercises don't mention the BAR. They use M249S now. Lighter, faster, better. But the idea remains. That movement matters. That fire can shape ground. That courage is not holding your position. It's knowing when to move forward even when everything tells you not to. So if you ever find yourself walking past a dusty display case in a museum, maybe at Camp Lejeune or Paris Island, and you see an old Browning automatic rifle sitting under glass, look closely. There's no plaque for Thomas Sledge. But the scratches on that metal, they tell a story. A story of a too-heavy gun, and a Marine who made it move like lightning. And you, would you have fired the last 20 rounds? Would you have stood when your leg bled and your shoulder failed? Would you have walked away from the medals, knowing you'd already earned something bigger? History doesn't always remember the names, but it remembers the lessons. And Thomas Sledge was a lesson carved into the rock of a Pacific hill, one burst at a time.